Well, for listeners of the Climate Pod, I'm sure you know David Wallace-Wells, but David Wallace-Wells is the New York Times essayist, best-selling science writer of The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. And at the Times, in his subscriber-only newsletter, he explores climate change, technology, and the future of the planet and how we live on it. His recent piece on the tragic floods in Texas called We Can Adapt and Prepare for Floods, but Will We? Is out now. And David Wallace-Wells, always great to talk to you, and I really appreciate you making the time to come on the show.
My pleasure. Good to be back. Good to talk to you too.
So in this piece, just thinking about the floods in Texas, you wrote, quote, "These days, more and more disaster stories appear to be playing out far from the coast in defiance of naive intuitions about climate risk and even of our recent experience of climate horror," unquote. What has struck you by what you've seen recently in Texas and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, in certain ways, I think of myself as someone who has a lot of knowledge about these issues and follows them very closely. On the other hand, it's also sometimes useful to remind myself that I haven't been in this space and focusing on climate for my whole life, and I'm still learning quite a lot. And I would have said, say 7, 8 years ago when I was, first working on climate, then writing my book, I probably would have told you that something like hurricanes represented like the clearest, most direct embodiment of climate risk to me. I worried about, effect on food and economic productivity. I worried about effect on violence, all that stuff. But like, if I had to communicate with someone, a normie, a non-climate normie about climate risk, it might be hurricanes that embody that threat most clearly. And then we went through a period with these really dramatic wildfires in California and in Canada and elsewhere. And I think people started to think about climate in terms of wildfire. I think they started to think about climate in terms of, like literally like communities being subsumed by fire, like we saw this past January in Los Angeles most dramatically, but we've seen many times over the last decade. And then we kind of moved on. We started thinking about wildfire smoke when that came to New York. So we've been through this period of where the sort of collective vision of what climate disaster looked like has moved. And I do think we're in a bit of a new phase now, at least to judge from my own social media feed. The clearest indication that I have regularly that we are in a different and, kind of dramatically different climate is how often I see video of really crazy floods, not on the coasts, not even necessarily along rivers, but in small cities and towns in South America and Europe and China and the US, where, whole roads are turned into rivers and cars are carried down them and sometimes people. And we're routinely seeing, meaningful levels of human death in those instances too. And I write in the piece, you can sort of see this in that $1 billion database that NOIA maintains, which, there are legitimate questions about what it actually measures because as we get richer, like the cost of disasters go up too. But just taking it as a, sort of dumb measure, like how many disasters did we have this year that produced $1 billion in damages? Not only are the numbers going up really dramatically, but the area that's increasing, the category that's increasing is what they categorize as just extreme storms. It's not hurricanes, it's not droughts, it's not wildfire. It's just basically like really bad thunderstorms in places that are not prepared for them. And that does a lot of, if that is, I mean, we could talk about why that is and what we're seeing, but just crediting that it is happening, that we are seeing more of that there are these more extreme floods in places well off the coast and often well away from rivers too. That wasn't the case in Texas, but what that means is that it really expands the amount of what we might call like defensible space there is, what we need to respond to, what we need to protect. It's not just, talking about where along the coast we need to build a flood barrier. It's not just about, managing, say, the forests of the American West in a better way or regulating home building around those forests so that they're more, more safe in the event of fire. It just means like kind of anywhere that a storm can happen is a meaningful risk. And that's everywhere. And, the Texas floods are a little bit different. They didn't come out of the blue. We did know that this was a place of extreme, flood risk, and local officials, local community, including the camp tragically did not respond to that risk in a thoughtful or productive way. But I think the larger lesson is a little bit more kind of like knee wobbling, which is that floods like this, like we saw in Valencia last year, can happen almost anywhere, and we are really and truly not prepared for them.
Yeah, and to that cost equation, like regardless of how you measure it, it's such an extraordinary rise that I just imagine like people are going to have to notice that. And you write in your piece about however this whatever this gets blamed on. And actually, I'll just quote you here. Quote: "Every weather disaster now has both human and climate causes, but we often argue about which side of the ledger should get the blame. When either way, the headline message is that we were not ready," unquote. So like to your point, there's a high level of unpreparedness around the globe. With those increasing costs, don't you feel like it's going to be harder for people to ignore what's happening, even no matter where you come down on this politically?
I mean, honestly, I think that I would tell you that the short answer is no. I don't think it's going to get harder for people to ignore. I mean, I wrote in my book that I think probably some large amount of these disasters that scientists have warned us about are going to come true, and that the dominant way that we will process that is by normalizing it. And I still think that that's true. I maybe even think that more true today. We talk about mitigation and adaptation, and I do think that it may be that the lion's share of the adaptation that we end up doing is normalization. And when I think about the disasters that we've seen just in the last couple of years, I mean, I wrote in my piece about the Texas floods just briefly about the fires in Maui, which were, horrifying when you read about, it's people jumping into the harbor to escape the flames and seeing the fire jump over their heads onto the boats that were floating in the water and burning those boats down. You see an entire indigenous capital destroyed, and the effect on the local community is so significant that it was one of the two main drivers of this completely unprecedented spike in national homelessness. When we had this horrifying report about how much new homelessness we had in America last year, and the two main drivers were kind of second order effects of all of the additional migration we've seen, and then the Maui wildfires. The fact that could meaningfully affect the homelessness data in a country of 330 million people tells you just how consequential that was. It was the deadliest North American wildfire in more than a century. And as I wrote about at the time, it also was another reminder, if we needed it, that we're now living in a different age of fire, which is, what the Daniel Swain likes to call the return of the urban firestorm. And almost every year now, when we talk about wildfire, we're not really talking even that much about the ones out in the forest. We're talking about the fires that are burning house to house and turning human structures into fuel, not turning the natural landscape into fuel, which is a very different space. But how much are we talking about the Maui fires? How much are we talking about the Palisades fires or the Altadena fires in California? I mean, that was 6 months ago, and it was, one of the richest, most high-profile, most well-connected neighborhoods in perhaps the most central capital of global culture in the world, and it burned down overnight, with many prominent, well-connected, famous people losing their homes in literally what would have been a nightmare scenario, like imagined by many of those people in the Hollywood films they made. If they were making Hollywood films about climate, they might have imagined exactly a scenario like this. Very rich people, very pretty people, losing everything in a flash with a day's warning or less. In certain cases, like a few hours warning. Are we talking about that? Is that dominating the news cycle? Is that a big part of national politics? The impact of Hurricane Helene was somewhat less made for TV, in the sense that, like, Western North Carolina is not the Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles, but they haven't recovered. That whole region has not recovered. The we see these disasters now every few months, and sometimes even more often. In the immediate aftermath of the Texas flood, there was a devastating one in New Mexico. There was one in North Carolina. They didn't kill as many people, but like as a pure hydrological event, were just as significant and dramatic. And what are we doing? How are we responding? How are we remembering? How are we mourning? How are we planning? How are we adapting? All of those, what are we doing? We're taking it in. We're often taking it in for a few concentrated days of alarm and despair, but then we are very much moving on. And when I think about the sort of mental model that I think a lot of climate campaigners had going back decades, that we would collectively be awoken out of our complacency by disaster. On some level, the signal example there is Katrina, which was a much more deadly event than the Texas floods. I think it was like 1,800 people died and destroyed a city. I mean, New Orleans is still not the city that it was before Katrina 20 years later. But for all the tragedy, it also meaningfully destroyed the presidency of George W. Bush and seemed, at least for a time, to discredit his party, his whole ideology of compassionate conservatism, climate denial. It seemed to break briefly. And we now have many more events at something like that scale. We see them much more directly because of social media and smartphones and cameras. We see them really directly. We don't just count on the CNN helicopters or whatever like we did with New Orleans. We see them directly. And yet, they are not making a mark on us, I don't think, in the way that Katrina did. And I think that that's a lesson about climate change and climate alarm and climate alarmism generally, which is that a lot of this stuff really does look most concerning, most scary in prospect, or when you first encounter it. And once you've begun to navigate a new landscape, even one that is full of so much more climate disaster, it's just hard not to normalize that and treat it not as something we need to avoid, but as something we need to navigate. And I think that's basically where we are, and it may be where we will be forever going forward. There will be things we do in response. We will try to protect each other. There will be migration. There will be all the things you talk about, I talk about all the time. But at a psychological, emotional level and at the level of public discourse, I do wonder if we're sort of past a peak of climate concern, and in some sort of fallow period there, where the green transition proceeds, local adaptation measures continue, but it is much less front of mind for many people than it seemed to be 5 or 7 years ago, even though over that same period we've just seen much, much more climate destruction.
I want to circle back to where we are politically and culturally, but I just want to drill down on that FEMA point and that Katrina point that you just made. We're coming up on the 20-year anniversary of Katrina, and like to your point, I was a little baby progressive at the time, just like learning about climate change, but at that time, the big narrative takeaway was the fact that Michael Brown was in charge of FEMA was a huge mistake, right? And it was a huge thing, like you mentioned,
Totally.
to discredit the Bush administration, but it was like, if we have people who are not properly qualified in positions of power, that can impact government response, right? Now we're in an entirely different political environment with the whole idea of FEMA and its funding is on the chopping block, right? And with the whole idea of a federal emergency response is in question. And we see with broader government cuts, what's happening with NOAA as well. What are you making of this reduction in funding and support at the federal government level?
I think it's really bad. I think it's really scary. And I think it's really depressing. And I also think it's really telling and indicative, because I think that we're seeing across our society, not just on the right, although it is much more grotesquely embodied on the right, a retreat in many areas from what had been as recently as 2015 to 2020, reflexive feelings of solidarity and mutual obligation. And I think we have moved in large part because of the experience of the pandemic towards a cultural and social and political vernacular that is much more nakedly mercenary, acquisitive, and self-interested. And I think we're seeing that at the individual level. I see that with people I know. I think we're seeing that at the political level, where we hear a lot now from, centrist Democrats that like the left went too far in demanding recognition and support for those with the least in our society. I think we see it at the global level, where something like the conceptual framework that gave rise to the Paris Accords and the hope that they may meaningfully blunt the trajectory of warming and stabilize the climate's future. It's not just that the Paris Accords themselves are somewhat in an ambiguous state. It's that we are just not talking about our obligations to one another on this planet in anything like the same language that we were in that period. And it makes me think that, if in 2015 and 2016 you would say, this is a major step for climate, these accords, they also sort of point towards some more cooperative global future. Now they seem much more like the relic of the unipolar 90s that was like 15 years out of date, and we only got around to codifying in 2015. And I don't know if we're going to head back in, we're going to reverse that trend and head towards a geopolitical future in which we feel again more solidarity. I think if I had to bet, I'd probably bet against it and bet towards the continuing growth of nationalistic and self-interested impulses here. And, there's probably no clearer way to illustrate that than when we talk about, heading into a future defined in some significant way by a much more ravaged, jagged climate landscape and the more frequent climate disasters that throw our communities into like chaos and trauma and to some extent death. To see that future coming and to respond to it by undermining weather forecasting and threatening to cancel the federal disaster response structure when no state is really capable of handling that on their own. Not to mention, of course, the kneecapping of renewables and the doubling down on the fossil fuel future that is making all this stuff worse. I would even put that in a separate bucket. Like on some level politically, I object to it. I find it horrifying, but I understand the cultural logic of doubling down on fossil fuels. I think it's, it's short-sighted, it's self-destructive, it's immoral, it's unethical, all that stuff. But I understand how we got there. But I'm like, you really want to be making plans with worse hurricane forecasts? You really want to be, telling people in Western North Carolina or in Central Texas, like, the federal government isn't going to be coming to help you? Is that really, like, is there any real logic there? Is there any human logic there? Is there any even tribal logic there? When so many of these people directly in harm's way are loyal Republicans and MAGA people. It just feels like, really catastrophic and destructive and downstream of this much bigger change, which has been, I said at the top, I think across the spectrum, a move towards more mercenary and self-interested logic. But I think more particularly, growing hostility and distrust of public goods defined really broadly. Defunding public media, considering selling public lands, instituting school vouchers across the country, even in all these states that have had them put them on the ballot and have them been rejected. So we're kind of going to war with public schools. We're going to war with science, which is, such a fundamental public good. We're, cutting NSF funding by 55%. I mean, everywhere you look, this administration in particular is just taking a bayonet to anything that looks like public. And that's really grotesque on many different levels. And, the Texas floods illustrate this really well. I mean, the FEMA response was terrible. They left all these people in the lurch. But even putting aside the response, It's like the flood maps told us that this kind of disaster was possible. The history of floods told us that it was possible in the region. There had been relatively local disasters of similar kinds happening within recent memory, within the decade. And why didn't they institute a flood protection system? It's because they couldn't afford it. Now, local governments don't have a lot of money to play with. State governments don't really have that much money to play with because they have to keep balanced budgets. The federal government is where you get that money. And if the federal government is not doing that work, there are going to be many, many, many fewer communities that are able to protect themselves in the way that we, if we went back in time, would like to have protected, the parts of Central Texas that are now really suffering and really reeling in quite a tragic way. And, I don't want to talk about that tragedy just in terms of, policy, like I'm just like from a wonk perspective, although that's really important. I mean, when you read these stories about the experience of these camp counselors leading these, 9 and 10 and 11-year-old girls through the dark and the storm, and parents, days after they learned that their kid had died, getting a letter in the mail from them that the camp, I mean, it's just like, what kind of monsters are we to say, like, we shouldn't be doing so much more to prevent tragedies like this from happening. And yet, I think the lesson of the last few years, again, very much concentrated on the right, but not limited to the right, is that to some extent we are those monsters.
Well, I the fact that you've done so much great work on COVID, and if people haven't read your retrospective on COVID published earlier this year, we'll link to it in the show notes and encourage everyone to go to read that, because that COVID and tying it back to the individualism spurred by living through that is very interesting, because the climate movement, the environmental movements have gone through ups and downs before. Like, I've lived through them, right? I remember the mid to late 2000s and, Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi on the couch, and how Al Gore, really broke through, and Obama going on the campaign trail and saying climate action was the number one priority. It was above, healthcare at the time. And that subsided, and Democrats weren't able to pass the Waxman-Markey bill. And then you go through a period of very little federal climate action beyond the Paris Climate Accords here in the U.S. And then it comes back, right? In the late 2010s, we have the Sunrise Movement. We have that IPCC 1.5. We have your book. We have those things break through, right? Even on like a smaller level, politically, culturally, like Amy Westerfeld's Drilled podcast, the Exxon New movement inside Climate News, Paul Schrader's First Reform movie. Like, there's a lot of political cultural movement in the late 2010s that lead to the Inflation Reduction Act right here domestically. And the only thing that's like keeping me from thinking we'll bounce back with more momentum soon is that COVID experience that you're talking about. Like, do you, like, I guess what gives you, is it just COVID that gives you a sense of pessimism that we'll see another politically cultural shift back to climate action?
I think there's a lot of, I mean, as any time you're trying to tell a story as complex as this, there's so many threads going into it. I would say it's important to keep in mind that this is all unfolding in a global context, and the American story is not the only story. And in fact, I think one of the big climate stories of the last few years is America withdrawing from its central role in global climate action. And one thing that has enabled in a perverse way is the expansion of the role for China. They're doing an awful lot on their own. I don't want to like overhype China as a good climate actor. There are plenty of things that they do that are not good still. But when you think about the green transition as a matter of getting as much clean energy out into the world as possible, as quickly as possible, and as cheaply as possible, this is actually not a period of slowdown. It's a period of acceleration. And that's largely due to China. And the way that technology is being bought up and implemented across the global south, I think has something to do with the evacuation of American leadership and the sense that like somebody in Pakistan or somebody in Brazil or somebody in who knows where, either at the policy level or at the individual level, isn't thinking like, well, maybe say at the policy level in particular, isn't like, we got to clear this with the US before we start doing business with China. They're like, well, the US is just not present. And so we're going to move on our own. And I think, again, I don't want to oversell this. I don't want to sound like too naive, a third worldist or whatever. But I do think there's a way of looking at the recent history of climate geopolitics here and saying that it may on net be good for the US to have become such a naked and unapologetic climate villain that nobody with climate concerns is now deferring to the judgment or leadership of America. We'll see. But I think that's in play. And I do think that like the basic global decarbonization project is in a very different place than it was a few years ago for a number of reasons, but including that the US is no longer dominating so much of the discussion there. So there's a big question of like, is this even a moment of climate despair? Or is it just that many of the political dynamics that people like you and me saw as inherent in the decarbonization project have been abandoned? And that the project of electrification and, path to net zero is now less motivated by concern for one another and more motivated by something else, some sense of what the planet's energy future is going to be like, maybe price points and, some amount of political autonomy where, poor countries are no longer dependent on foreign, sometimes malicious actors for their energy, but can build it out domestically. All of these things are happening, and so I don't know. I'm sort of two minds about it myself. But if I think about the basic, and I would say probably I'm of two minds also about the secondary question, which is like, okay, so if we're moving headlong into this future where we're actually building out clean energy pretty quickly, not as quickly as maybe I would like, but still astonishingly quickly. We're not retiring fossil fuel all that fast, but we're probably going to start doing it to some degree. But we've lost the moral foundation that we thought was necessary for that. And politics as a whole in the US and really all around the world has sort of retreated from the moral language of climate. Is that reversible? I think I don't think we know the answer. I mean, honestly, I don't think we know the answer, but I do think that COVID was a huge, huge turning point, and that we under acknowledge its effect on us psychologically and politically in almost every aspect of our lives. I think we do that in part to cope because we don't want to believe that it was that bad. In fact, often when we tell ourselves, I don't feel this way, but like when America tells itself it was really bad, actually what they're saying is like we did too much to stop the disease, and like the response was too much, not that the disease itself was so catastrophic, which it was. That's another kind of coping mechanism, but it also essentially is pushing us away from acknowledging what it means that 1.5 million Americans died of this disease. Tens of millions were hospitalized. Probably something close to 10 million people are, left disabled in some degree from their encounter with it. Maybe not quite that many, but in the millions. So many people lost loved ones. So many people suffered as a result of the response. I'm somebody who thinks that part of the story gets wildly overhyped, but we shouldn't dismiss it. Like, it was tough to, have your kids out of school. It was tough to not be able to socialize for a period of time, even if it was only something more like 3 months, not 3 years, as people on the right like to say. Nevertheless, it was tough. We did lose people, and sometimes we were not able to say goodbye to them, and that was really difficult too. All of these things, people lost businesses. The trauma was really significant and real. I think that altogether, the basic social coping mechanism that we've come up with is not just to live in denial about it, which is to say, to pretend that we didn't have to do anything or it wasn't that important. We're doing that. But it's not just that. It's also to resent the fact that we did anything at all and try to find people to pin the blame on for making us do it. So whether that's, Anthony Fauci or liberals generally, or our friends and family who might have shamed us for like socializing indoors without a mask or something. We really want to believe that it was unnecessary and came out of that with a much lower willingness to do much at all for the people around us. And that's especially tragic because, as I wrote really at the time in the spring of 2020, on some level, the whole thing was really inspiring. The whole world undertook a global project of self-protection and solidarity, health solidarity. And it was, partly out of fear. It wasn't just out of consideration for the lives of others. But we really radically changed our lives quite quickly and quite, dramatically. And that was amazing for someone who had spent the last couple of years worrying about what kind of change and what scale of change was possible on climate. We did not know about, I first read about COVID-19 in like the last days of 2019, like December 31st or something. Most people didn't really hear about it until the middle or end of January, maybe even later. And by March, we're like literally in lockdown. That is like, an unprecedented shift in the basic behavior of people. And my despair and frustration, the long fallout of COVID, the way that we refuse to see the history clearly, the way that we refuse to do the moral math of death, honestly, the way that we balance the burdens that we shouldered against the people we were protecting and pretend like the burdens were much more important, the way that we resent one another more, the way that we've grown more acquisitive and self-interested, all of that is just especially bleak to me and depressing because it came not just in the aftermath, but as a reaction to what I found an inspiring performance of global solidarity. And it was like the world was like, they tried to do my politics, and then they were like, we're never going to do that again, ever. And we literally have now. There are bans against public health authorities making any guidance in the future for any kind of disease in like dozens of states. Bans. So if we get, people talk about bird flu, which like officially has a 50% mortality rate. That's, I think, certainly overstated. The version that's circulating now, to the extent that we've seen it, has a much lower death rate than that. But nevertheless, imagine that bird flu jumped into humans and had a 50% mortality rate. You're telling me you're going to be happy that you had laws on the books prohibiting public health officials from offering guidance in the face of that? In half of the country or more? That is insane. We have bans on mask wearing in New York State. Just like, even now, you want someone who's had their immune system compromised because they just had a kidney transplant, not be able to get on a bus in flu season with a mask on? It's like, and yes, there are some carve-outs in those laws so that those people are theoretically entitled, but the whole social message that it sends is that anytime someone puts a mask on, it's at best questionable and perhaps even illegal. That is just not a standard of human fellow feeling at all. It is the opposite. And we have designed that future for ourselves in response to COVID out of outrage that we tried to do anything at all as, the privileged people who were able to survive it and who want to tell ourselves that we survived it, not because we collectively behaved in ways that limited the spread of the disease. But, when I think about Maha in particular, it's like we tell ourselves we survived it because we were better people. We were healthier. We were younger. We ate better. We exercised more. These are, just so stories that allow us to pat ourselves on the back and not acknowledge the central fact, which is that a huge amount of that whole experience was a kind of Russian roulette. And even if the death rate was 1% for the population as a whole, and even if it was for me, someone like me, a tiny fraction of 1%, nevertheless, like, it basically doubled the risk of death faced, an infection, doubled the risk of death faced by basically anyone at any age, which meant that if I got sick with COVID, I would have twice as much chance of dying that year as I had if I had not gotten COVID in 2020. And that is not a landscape of risk that any of us are comfortable with. And so we come up with all of these other stories to allow us to pretend individually and collectively that it wasn't actually the case that we were that much at risk. Unfortunately, it opens us up to behaviors that are make us vulnerable to future challenges, both future pandemics, future health risks, but also climate, which is in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of adaptation, primarily a collective job, and one that we won't be able to do well if we just leave it up to individuals, which is, I think, the direction that we're all heading in.
Yeah, you wrote everything that we've talked about. All of this domestically here in the United States is impacted by the budget bill, the reconciliation bill that just passed. And I'm just curious from your standpoint, writing about this, following also the Inflation Reduction Act, which was in the United States the largest climate action, federal climate action that we've seen. I'm curious, watching this most recent bill and how it passed, what you were thinking at the time, because as I mentioned, like, this is going to impact COVID response, climate response, you name it.
Yeah, I think I think of it generally as a war on public goods on every front, and in that way, an enactment of what had been a splinter fringe of the Republican coalition for 50 or 70 years. At times was a more central part of their program, but was always so destructive that it would never be the dominant force of Republican policymaking when in power. And this bill basically enacts that agenda down the line and is, among many other things, a test of whether our politics have really passed into what scholars sometimes call a post-material phase, whether people will simply be happy, people on the right will be happy to see the libs owned and the deep state slashed, or whether they will recognize the way in which these cuts are damaging to them and their communities, and have some kind of reckoning with what that means ideologically and in terms of their tribal partisan loyalties. I don't know the outcome of that experiment. There's been a lot of talk in the around the time of the passage of the bill about I think it's 17 million people who are expected to lose health insurance as a result of it. But the Medicaid unwinding that Joe Biden presided over kicked 10 million people off of health insurance, and left on net, I should say, like the country was more well insured when he left office than it was in 2019. But so many people had gotten public health insurance because of the pandemic, and then we basically took that away. And it wasn't Donald Trump and it wasn't Republicans who did that. And I didn't really hear much about that. I didn't really hear much about it on the campaign. I didn't hear, it's like, I worry on many levels about the degree to which our country is responsive to the material effects of public policy, and the degree to which we've moved on to like pure virtual reality culture war stuff. And the fate of the IRA is a really interesting showcase here, because it was designed to address this problem really directly. It was designed, it was not going to be punitive. There were not going to be taxes in it. There's one methane fee, but basically otherwise was like almost all carrots, almost no sticks. It was all free handouts. Nobody could complain about losing out because nobody was going to suffer. Maybe you could say you could relatively suffer if you were like, someone got an EV tax credit and you didn't, but it's like, it was not like, not like any other climate policy that had been proposed before. It was just all goodies. My friend Tim Sahag called it the bottomless mimosa approach to climate policy. And beyond that, the expectation was that money would change the politics of climate change and green energy by flowing primarily to purple areas and purple states. It's often talked about as red states, but it's really more like, purple places in purple states, or red districts in purple states. And, on some level, that is what is happening when you look on the ground. Like in Texas, every year, they try, right wingers in the state legislature try to kneecap renewables to the advantage of fossil fuels, and every year they lose. Why is that? It's because in the last few years, clean energy has cut the electricity bills in Texas, the cost of electricity in Texas by 50%, and cut their risk of blackout from something like 16% to 1%. And enough people know that in Texas that they don't let their legislators play a culture war with clean energy. At the national level, it hasn't really worked out that way. Climate change wasn't a big issue for Donald Trump on the campaign trail, but it also wasn't a big issue for Kamala Harris, and it hadn't been a big issue for Joe Biden. It was basically invisible. There weren't a lot of people rallying to defend the IRA or climate investments, just as there weren't a lot of people rallying to repeal them. And so the theory of the IRA, which some people call deliverism, where you want to actually give benefits to people that they can see clearly and that they will then become politically loyal to you as a result, at least on that timescale of 2 years, it just didn't work out. It didn't mobilize any meaningful coalition around clean energy. And the end result is that now we have all of that gutted. And I don't think there's going to be dramatic, at least short-term, political blowback for that. I think that the things in that bill that are going to be problematic for Republicans, there are a lot of them, or there may be a lot of them. We'll see how it all plays out. But I wouldn't put the brutal cuts to clean energy at the top of that list. But what I find most perverse or ironic about this is that when I think about the 2024 election and the Trump coalition and how it was different from the Trump 2016 or 2020 coalition, there are basically two buckets of changes. One is that he's doing much better with young, especially Black and brown men, right? But then there's this, at the high level, it's he has this whole tech right futurist contingent that is embodied by Elon Musk, but also represented by all of these other people, Mark Andreessen, what's his name, the Anduril guy, the guys at Palantir, even as Peter Thiel has kind of retreated from Trumpism. Nevertheless, you have this whole new Silicon Valley energy that's we need republicanism to build the future. And what they mean by that is primarily AI. And we could talk for a whole other episode about how insane those people's critique of the Biden era was and how much they exaggerated the degree to which they were being attacked or undermined by the federal government or by our culture. This was a period in which these people all became even more insanely wealthy than they used to be, and their companies became even more powerful. Nevertheless, they came out of that period feeling incredibly resentful and restrained. And they were we need a dramatic shakeup because we need to secure the AI future. They often talk about it in geoeconomic terms, in terms of the new Cold War with China, but even narrowly about just the social good that would come from an AI revolution. And I have a lot of doubts, or at least skepticism, around the margins of those claims, but I do think this is a really significant technology. I do think meaningful progress there will have an impact on the world. I don't think that's completely crazy. It's not the metaverse or whatever. There is something real going on here. And so when you look pulling back at the global picture, you would say China spent the post-pandemic period really investing in clean energy and green tech. And the US spent that period betting on AI. That is kind of the story that governs this rivalry. It's they bet on that and we bet on this. Now, it's important to note, even with all of our cultural attention on AI, it's not clear how big our lead over China is. It's not growing. It's almost certainly shrinking. They may even be close to at parity with us on AI. But fundamentally, given the kind of artificial intelligence that Silicon Valley, neo-fascists are trying to develop, they need electricity at mass scale. They need it now. They need it cheap. What can get that for them? Solar power is like the only answer, solar and battery. And yet, they empowered Donald Trump. They, to some extent, bankrolled his reelection. They gave his coalition this sheen, this futurist sheen, which could be held up in contrast to a backward-looking Democratic Party. That contrast was like always, I think, a little unfair, but in the public mind, that was part of what was going on. And yet, what did they get out of it? They got the most promising source of the main input that they need to engineer their technological revolution cut at the root by the party that they helped elect. You can't build a nuclear power plant in a year. You can't build a geothermal power source in a year. There's a problem with permitting and the transmission and the grid around green energy, but at the moment, they are the best thing we have for fast build out of cheap power. And the Republican Party that was put into power in part by the tech right has turned around and just totally destroyed that dream of theirs. And, you know, it's a little like, on some level, you're almost tempted to laugh because you're like, how could these people be so blinkered by ideology that they didn't see this risk coming to begin with? How did they get in bed with these people who did not share their interests? And how do they not understand what to do to secure some amount of support for a real build out of a new electric state? But however many of those petty feelings you may have personally, like the place that leaves us is in a world that is rapidly electrifying, in which the US is rapidly doubling down on its status as a petrostate. And that leaves us in a really bad spot. And I think it will produce meaningful defection in that cohort in the tech right. But, you know, ultimately, really, we're talking about a couple of dozen billionaires. It's not like we're talking about a mass political movement. And I don't know what the ultimate cost of this bill will be politically. It seems to be very unpopular. But, you know, MAGA has survived a lot of unpopular work to this point. I would say a couple of things just in closing about the current political moment and where I think the aftermath of the BBB and where we are with Trump really kind of leaves us. And I think both are a bit more hopeful than I just sounded. The first is, both of which are totally unrelated to climate. Just to like say them. The first is that we have seen an astonishing reversal in public opinion on immigration, even just over the course of the past few months. This is a issue which we have been told ourselves again and again over the last decade was absolutely central in explaining the rise of Donald Trump and the staying power of MAGA. And we were told in the fall that it was a losing issue for Democrats and that Donald Trump was on the right side of popular opinion. And we were told when there were protests in Los Angeles against the brutal ICE raids by masked people cosplaying secret police, even as they are real police. We were told that those protests were counterproductive and that Democrats and liberals were on the wrong side of that issue again, and that what we should do is lower the salience of the conflict over migrant rights. We were told it was a mistake to go visit people deported to other countries, to brutal prisons in other countries. And here we are, and American support for immigration is now at an all-time high. And there's a lot to unpack there. In fact, this issue has been really, really volatile over the last decade. We were also very supportive of immigration in the first Trump term. But among other things, what that tells me is that we take for granted a lot of aspects of political reality and, you know, what's politically possible. We take them as permanent. We take them as unmovable. We take public opinion as really stable. And I think at least on immigration, some other things move less quickly, but at least on immigration, we have seen, you know, the volatility should encourage us because it tells us that, public opinion is It can move very quickly. And then the last thing I would say is about, the way that these dynamics have played out in New York, where I live, where we just had, Zoran Mamdani win the Democratic mayoral primary. And, again, from a place where, in January, he had like 1% of support. Nobody was taking him seriously. In a city where the previous mayoral election, which elevated Eric Adams, was heralded nationally as a sign of the end of progressive politics, and the rise of some post woke, Democratic Party. And here we are 4 years later, and we are probably going to elect a 33-year-old Democratic socialist, who has done a lot of stuff on climate, actually, although he rarely talks about it in those terms, to the most powerful executive position occupied by a leftist in America for at least 75 years, and maybe in literally all of American history. That is really quite profound and astonishing. And I don't want to oversell Zoran as a mayor. We don't know how he's going to be. There's a lot of complications there. There's local resistance. He may not ultimately even win the general, although I think that's a pretty safe bet at this point. But this was the kind of an outcome that we were not just told, but maybe felt ourselves as people on the left side of the spectrum was simply not possible anymore, as recently as this winter. And now we're in a very, very different place. Now, what does it mean? I don't think it necessarily means that AOC is going to be the nominee for president in 2028 running on the Green New Deal. Although I actually think it's quite possible that AOC is the Democratic nominee for president, but I we'll see. There's a lot to be determined. And I think one of the big mistakes in all of this is the way that we've so nationalized our politics that we don't allow for divergent experimentation at the local level, and we don't defer to local communities, so that the federal government is still going to war with renewable energy in Texas, even though Texans are saying don't do that. But it does open up a whole new horizon of political possibility out of the aftermath of the pandemic and the Trump defeat, which have dispirited so many people with higher political hopes. It tells us something quite profound about, the things we think are not possible. Some of them are, and some of them are not possible. Some of them are possible. Some of them are not possible. Some of them are possible. And we should carry that lesson with us when we think about absolutely everything, from fights to do better climate resilience planning at the very local level, all the way up to contemplating the future of geopolitics and what might come out of our new Cold War. The truth is, on all of these fronts, whatever our models tell us, whatever our intuitions tell us, and whatever our polls tell us, the future is not written, right? It can change very quickly. And on climate in particular, I would say, in 2019, you could point to China and say, wow, they're doing a lot of clean energy. And even if you were optimistic from there about what China was going to be doing about clean energy, you would have been completely humiliated by how much they've actually done in the 5 years since. And what that means globally, there are many reasons why the US and Europe and other parts of the world are moving more slowly, and that's unfortunate. But when we talk about China, leapfrogging the US or lapping the rest of the world on clean tech, that is basically an experiment that really took off 5 years ago. Not a long time. And it's, I think, useful and inspiring for all of its flaws, the Chinese model, for all of its horrors, political and otherwise, to see that such a transformation of the global climate narrative could be engineered in one place over a 5-year period. I think it should give us some, at least it should fight our intuitive sense of fatalism about where we're heading coming out of the pandemic. And with Donald Trump, the US is in a bad place right now. A lot of the rest of the world is pretty ugly too. But, change happens, whether we think it's going to happen.
That is a great place to wrap. And if you don't, I don't know how you deal with flattery, but I gotta say this right before we wrap. between now and the last time you did the show, you moved the times and writing this newsletter. And I gotta tell you, David, I've been following your work for 8 years now, so I know how great of a writer you are. But the consistency with which how great your pieces are in the newsletter is so special. And I just gotta say that.
Well,
And it's
thanks.
remarkable. So for people who are, and the fact that you write, and you obviously got famous for climate and COVID, but the breadth of issues that you write about with such skill and talent is just it truly is amazing, and I'm always so wonderful to read. So I thank you for that and for all your work and for coming on the show to talk about this stuff.
Well, the admiration is mutual. So thanks for having me on, and hopefully we'll cross paths again sometime soon.